Botswana's President Ian Khama slams his Zimbabwean counterpart, President Robert Mugabe. Now, Khama, who is set to step down as president in 2018, called for Africa's oldest leader to do the same when Zimbabwe goes to the polls in 2 years' time. He said Mugabe had overstayed his welcome. The Botswana leader also called Mugabe a liability to the entire Southern Africa region, as millions of Zimbabweans are economic refugees in neighboring countries. In 2013, Khama was the only African leader who stood with the Western countries in disputing Mugabe's victory in the elections, declared a farce by opposition parties. Well, I'm joined now in studio by political analyst Sifiso Mahlangu. Good evening, Sifiso, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good evening, Africa.
Good evening, Africa, indeed. Now, Botswana leader Ian Khama has once again called on Mugabe to step down. How different is this from his previous call to Mugabe to step down after the 2013 disputed elections?
I think this is a hashtag in parliamentary language. This is a hashtag in topical language. His Excellency President Ian Khama has produced a hashtag against Mugabe saying he needs to fall. And that's a very powerful statement coming from the head of state. President Khama's father was, as you know, the president of Botswana. So for him, it's not inane that he would make these comments. I mean, he grew up viewing Mugabe as the president. So it's not an elite state that President Mugabe would like to be the Nebuchadnezzar of Africa and perhaps rule forever. I think what the SADC region needs to be very vocal about is what happens after he leaves. Is Zimbabwe ready? Is the economy ready? Let's talk about who will come after President Mugabe.
I'm actually going to want to hear your views on that.
For that matter.
That's actually one of my questions for you, because President Mugabe is now 92 and there is no real succession plan. I mean, do you expect a violent power struggle to come up with Zanu-PF?
Well, the reality of life is only two things here. Either we live to die or Christ returns. That's the two options. President Mugabe is not going to live forever. So at some stage, there's got to be a nuanced conversation about what will happen after Mugabe.
When he leaves.
And we're hosting a convention next week at the University of South Africa called the Africa Enterprise, where I'll be chairing and discussing with ministers of the clergy, with academics, some politicians, some from the country, to have a conversation on what may or should happen after Mugabe. The decision they're taking now, the talks in Zimbabwe, are to appoint his wife right after he sits. He's been the longest standing president in the world. How Zimbabweans will think beyond Mugabe, they need to talk about. Often the listeners say I'm usually critical, the students say I'm very critical of the West. And sometimes we have a lot of reason to. But this discussion must be had. And the thing is this, Botswana cannot demand that he falls. South Africa cannot say he falls, in the same way that I don't like it when Americans say South Africa needs to remove President Jacob Zuma. If it's a democracy, the people need to do that through the ballot. And so we're making suggestions, and we're making cooperative governance suggestions. We're meeting with members, we're meeting with clergymen. We'll be meeting with business, but it's important for Zimbabweans to stand up themselves and make the decision. Now, there are great leaders in Zimbabwe, but that job cannot be done in their absence. You cannot shave a man's head in his absence. So we can't lead and direct them without their
consent. I mean, Sifis, you mentioned something very important there, that Zimbabweans have to go to the ballots to actually vote Mugabe out of seat. But there have been so many rumors in past times that most of the elections are actually rigged. So how do we know that Zimbabweans really have that freedom of expression, of democracy, of actually electing their own president?
It depends who owns the electorate, for that matter. who owns the ballot box for that matter. A lot of those systems cannot be independent. Mr. Morgan Tsvangirai, continued to declare an incompetence and an unrighteousness in the system. And, President Mugabe has made it very clear that he's not going to step down. So we're dealing with a two-sided coin here. It is maybe to liberate Zimbabweans, but they've got to think that for themselves. And, they have a high population of 14 million. People can think it. But it's easier for us to say Zimbabweans should do that because we're not in the same conditions. We're not in the same era.
Yes.
We're not in those situations. It's very difficult to be in Zimbabwe and speak against President Mugabe. We must be factual with that. It's very difficult to say anything that is against the president. It even might be life-threatening. We've seen
situations where people have actually lost their lives,
with Pastor Irvin. We've seen
exactly being arrested.
We've seen with the recent protests. It's not easy to be democratic in that country, and so the African leaders must perhaps join together and be united in a voice. But we cannot do that in isolation from the Zimbabweans. They need to arise in that country and mark their own future. They need to be an infallible voice. And
so
without them, it cannot be done.
But how do not just SADC leaders, now the African leaders, as you're saying, in the entire continent, help these Zimbabweans come out of the situation, actually give them a voice and give them a foot to stand on and say, okay, we're going to rise up against Mugabe and there will not be any violence against anybody who stands up against him? Well,
in the first place, there were two options given. How you deal with constituency and how you deal with a state. When you're a foreign country, yes. You deal with them economically. Now they put bans on Zimbabwe. Many countries don't trade with them. Many awards have been, withdrawn from President Mugabe. He is the most educated president in the world. He's an educationalist, but a lot of those awards have been withdrawn. So he's an economics man and an educationist,
an academic,
and
yes.
That's true. Now it should go beyond the markets. It should go beyond economics. The AU, the SADC region, has got to be very vocal to say, we cannot make you a chairperson. They made that mistake unless you deal with your country's issues. And perhaps South Africa must also come and say, we cannot just allow through our various ports of entry Zimbabweans to come in because we are being sympathetic to these people. To the Zimbabweans whom we love, whom we call our brothers, but things continue to go wrong in their country and we allow it. We're going to possibly run out of time tonight.
Yes, well, finally, before you go, is it actually fair to lay all the blame for Zimbabwe's economic woes on Mugabe's continued rule? Is that a fair deduction?
Well, the West and white monopoly capital is real, and it's there, and that affects the continent of Africa. But we cannot just override it because white monopoly capital is real, but so is black monopoly poverty. And one has to create a great balance between that. You don't just want to take orders and feed the capitalists, but you cannot starve because you don't want to trade. And so at some stage you've got to have a conversation. This is an economy, and no country is a nomad. No man is an island. So it's up to Zimbabweans, and particularly the state and the government, to begin to open its borders and open its country and say, let's speak, yes. Let's trade, and let's run a democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Sefus, and we do hope to hear from you after the meeting that you say you'll be having to discuss Zimbabwe's future.
Well, we take it up on Twitter. And
we'll be following you definitely, but we'd like to have you back in studio after that
meeting. The viewers continue to,
the discussion does continue.
To hashtag. And
thank you so much. That was Sefus Mahlangu, our political analyst there, and as he said, the conversation does continue. Do follow us at ANN7 TV, and let's talk about what's happening in Zimbabwe, your views, your comments, and if you are in Zimbabwe yourself, let us know how some of the African leaders can actually help you get out of the situation that you're in right now.